I'm Janine, and this is Outside the Box. Standing by to join me is Matthew Brownstein. He is connecting with us from New York City. He's a teacher in the New York school system, and I'm very excited to have him on the show. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I had reached out to you because I told you I was writing my second book, Better Humans: What the Mental Health Pandemic Teaches Us About Humanity. And originally I contacted you because I thought you were related to my one of my favorite teachers, Sharon Brownstein, when I was growing up there, and you weren't, but I was so happy you connected anyway. So thank you.
Yeah, well, it's important to take advantage of really special connections, and so I'm glad that we got here from that interesting intro.
Absolutely. So tell us about what it is you do.
So I work at a New York City school, specifically in Corona, Queens, and so during our conversation, you might hear some cars blasting across Northern Boulevard. Our school is located just about 10 minutes away from Flushing Meadow Park. And I'm an elementary school assistant principal. And so I work with teachers to support them to reach their instructional goals. I work with students to keep them safe and happy. So that means supporting them in the hallways, in the cafeteria, when they enter the school, when they leave the school. And so one of the things I love about being an elementary school assistant principal, is just that I'm kind of doing all of the things that are needed in a given day over the course of the year.
That's great. So tell me what it's been like in the pandemic for you as a teacher. My heart goes out to you, your staff, and all counselors, because there was no workshop that was like, okay, now we're going to get ready for a pandemic and you're going to work from home and deal with everything you had to deal with. So what has it been like? I would say, March 2020.
So we are always asked to do hard things. The difference during this last over 2 years is we were doing hard things every day, and we weren't sure when it was going to end, and we weren't sure what our roles needed to be. And so, in the long list of things that needed to be done over the course of the day, sometimes it was hard to know where the priorities lie. Clearly, keeping our kids safe and happy is part of it, but there were a lot of question marks around what were the most important things to do to achieve that goal.
Yeah. And now, prior to March 2020, did you feel like we were in a mental health crisis where students were facing rates of depression and suicide and all the other things?
There's no question that the data shows that depression, rates of suicide attempts, suicide completions are, if not at an all-time high, are in that area. And doing some podcasts, listening to podcasts, doing my own personal research, a lot of that is attributed to social media as being the major factor that kind of distinguishes this generation from previous ones. And unquestionably, the pandemic disconnected us further, connected us in certain ways and disconnected us in other ways.
I'm hearing a lot from students who are saying how social media it's been good, but it's been really detrimental because they're obviously the fear of missing out, or the leaving people out, or you're comparing yourself to other people's body types or the way they dress, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on with a full list, but it's been very detrimental to see things that it's really smoke and mirrors a lot of times too. It's an illusion of what people are really like.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, especially when we're talking about late elementary, early middle school, as developmentally, it's normal to pay extra close attention to what your peers think about you. And there's that's social media presents a warped, overdrive, hyperbolic injection of that tendency, that dynamic that's already in place. And so, we as adults, we feel this to some extent as well. We've all been there where we've spent too much time passively consuming information You use the word compare. The phrase I use is compare and despair, right? Where we are comparing yourself to someone else and just feeling bad about it. Sure, there are those moments where you have that uplifting feeling of celebration, like, oh, I love what that person's doing, or that's a beautiful photo. But we can all be honest with ourselves, but that doesn't happen with regularity. As adults, we ideally have other spaces and communities and outlets where we feel that sense of belonging. But for students and young people who are just beginning to figure out who their people are, they don't have that rock, that place, that support system where they are getting that feedback that's helping them feel grounded and ready to go. So instead, they're just bombarded with this feedback that they don't know what to do with. And it's really challenging to navigate.
Yeah. And as adults, we take these devices and we're neglecting our relationships. We're neglecting ourselves, our relationships, because we get sucked in to this passive, just swiping, right? Mm-hmm. It's a detriment.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, I heard someone I listen to regularly is Rich Roll. He's a runner. He's an athlete. He's a writer. And one of the things that he also speaks about his experiences with his kids. And, his thing is like, what he tells his kids is I'm not asking you to disconnect, but be mindful of how much of your time are you passively consuming and how much of your time are you creating. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And I think one of the things that I'm curious about is helping students not only be mindful of that breakdown, but also become self-aware. How does it feel when you are passively consuming, right? Like, does it feel good? And there's some of that anecdotal experiential evidence that I think can speak volumes to students versus just saying, get off your device.
Right. I mean, I've learned from disconnecting from the phone when I go off and I do something that's challenging, but not too challenging. I mean, I could give you examples, whether it's playing a hard electric guitar song or learning to ride a 3-wheel motorcycle, or like these are things I've wanted to do. And after I do them, I feel exhilarated. I feel like this was a great new adventure. And I think having that mindset in life is very beneficial to students.
I'm totally with you. And, I'm a proud parent, educator, and also I was a participant in the public school system. And being part of the largest public school system in America, sometimes it doesn't always facilitate some of that risk taking, which, as you spoke to, is a lot of usually the space where we tend to find our greatest joys and our sense of self ultimately.
Right. I do public speaking, and especially to schools. And I was asked one time, can you talk to students about the keys to success?
Yeah.
And I thought, oh gosh, I said, I'm going to be honest with you. I was a DF student, a big part growing up. And I didn't realize I had problems reading and paying attention and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, really, for me, the key to success is being able to fall down and get up on a loop, on repeat, and just say, you know what, that's okay. That didn't happen, but maybe this next door will open and something else even better will come along, or I'll learn something from that rejection or that failure. It's not, to me, it's not really failure. It's just learning.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I think the question that I think about in my own head, I think about with my colleagues are, what are the conditions where students and young people and anyone really can learn that relationship between success and failure.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, as you said, you kind of just have to do it. But as educators, we can create and set up environments where students can explore some of those questions, and then we can debrief them. I think that's one of the coolest things about being an educator, right? Is I've taken students backpacking, and students who can't find their notebook or pencil on the daily in class when they are in charge of the map that day, and they're in charge of packing food and putting away a really intricate many part stove, for instance. Like, that kid's on it. So, it's really easy as an educator, if you're only seeing them in the classroom, to draw conclusions like this kid is lazy or disorganized or fill in the blank. How lucky was I to be in a different situation with that student, for just to see some other sides of that person, but also for that person to see different sides of themselves.
Confidence boosting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I always remember growing up, I was not a good test taker. And my dad used to always say, ask the teacher if you can do something else. And I'd say, oh, no, it's fine. I'll just try to study harder. And I just could not deal with tests. And when I finally learned to advocate for myself and say, do you think I could do a research project or a poster or whatever? And the more I did this in high school and then college, I felt less stupid, because I felt stupid growing up. And the grades were defining me and my self-esteem. And then when I learned about their different types of intelligences, and I thought, oh, okay, then that's okay. I couldn't get it this way, but look what I was able to do with the information that way.
Right. And so it sounds like your parents had a lot to do with that, where you began to try different ways to show your learning. And what happens then, and I'm sure there's some sociological term for this, but you're creating some successes, and there's probably some external motivation there, right? So before, you were feeling deterred and defeated by bad grades, and now you're starting to get some positive feedback. But then what happens, and this is like the magical formula for success in my book, is where you start to build that sense of, oh, like, I can do hard things. I'm finding some competence. Like, I'm a competent person, and you begin to have some of that internal motivation, which is, that's where it's at, right? When you start to see yourself as someone who can transcend and be resilient, and who likes to do, again, I come back to this phrase, hard things, I think is what I'm trying to help my students realize about themselves.
That's great. So I'm seeing a lot of different articles about mental health and the pandemic. I'm also seeing that kids, they were once remote, now they're in person, but they're behind. And, there have been so many instances in the news with gun violence and anxiety and depression, and it's been amped up from the pandemic. But how do you handle the fact that students are behind when you also want them to be mentally healthy?
So I think the first thing, and this is not feedback for you, but this is what I'm doing, is we don't talk about them being behind.
Good.
Talking about every article, everything. There's value in doing asset-based learning and education. So instead of us looking at them as behind, it's like where are they? And do we have the right tools right now to know where they are? And oftentimes we don't. If we're looking just purely at, reading levels, for instance, which we've used historically forever to determine reading levels, we're realizing now, and many researchers have known this for a while, that the ways in which we were determining read levels weren't actually that accurate. So yeah, we're using tools that are not always necessarily that accurate, and we're using only a handful of them. And so taking stock of where students are, what skills have they learned since the pandemic?
Yeah.
What do they know right now? And really structuring our supports and our learning, building off of where they are. There's no question that there are students that are coming in. I just had a conversation with some colleagues just downstairs a few hours ago, where we were teaching teachers how to do open tasks in math. The basic
open tasks in math?
Open tasks. So the basic idea is, instead of asking our students, what's 6 times 3? We can ask them, what are different ways we can create the number 18, right? Create it by saying 9 times 2, 17 plus 1. So you can ask a student who may not necessarily know multiplication yet. That student can answer that question. And we're not saying, like, let's lower the expectations. But if we notice a student is just using addition, for instance, well, now we know we can build off of what they know about addition and then work into multiplication. And so one of the things that these teachers have recognized about just something as simple, and I say simple because it's one thing, but how profound this one thing like math open tasks can be for a classroom is students have different entry points to really say and share what they're thinking and what they know. And teachers have only said like, wow, like students know way more than I expected them to. You know, they're more willing to take risks. And so this is just one routine that we've introduced into our classrooms, which have changed teachers' mindsets of students, and of course, students' mindsets are changing as well.
Definitely. Well, it's like the example you gave with taking them backpacking and having to read a map. You're looking at their comprehension and the way they learn in a different way, which is so powerful.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
I think something just to note on that experience too. I think one of the things that sometimes we get into trouble when we're talking about mental health is, you know, we talk about like, let's just get tough with our kids. So yeah, you know, Mr. Brownstein's talking about doing hard things. So let's throw them in the water and do something really hard. Let's learn how to swim that way. But that's not what the research shows. The research doesn't show you just throw them in the water and then they learn how to swim. What we do is we give them realistic expectations of how hard something is. We set up environments and learning opportunities where students build the competencies to then be in a situation where they're able to apply those skills through content knowledge in a meaningful way. But then also they've got the mental tools to figure out what to do when things get really hard and they're pushed beyond their normal comfort levels. Just a really personal example on that. I've been running a lot more since the pandemic, and recently I ran a half marathon. So I got my personal best time, but it was nowhere near as fast as I wanted to go. And what I realized as I kind of took stock of the race afterwards was I've been running a lot of miles. There have been moments where I've run hard at the pace that I wanted to run, but I didn't do enough training where it's so simple. It's like where I got really tired and then figured out how to push past that. And so when it came to the race and I was pushing the pace that I wanted to go and I got really tired, my brain, my soul, however you want to define it, just wasn't prepared to push through that challenge. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, like I got to train harder. But what I'm realizing is what I need to do is I need to create the conditions where I have practice and I build up the comfort level around pushing through discomfort.
Yes.
And that's something that I want to kind of apply in my school as well, and kind of respond to doing hard things through that lens.
You know, I've had that experience in yoga. Okay. So when you're holding a pose, and I'm not an expert, but even if you're doing like a tree pose, I don't know if you're that familiar with yoga, but or a down dog or whatever it is, and you're like thinking, I can't take this anymore.
Right.
And you hold it, it does apply to life.
Yeah.
And the other thing I noticed too is how you deal with difficult situations or difficult people applies to yoga. And so yoga helps me breathe and process things and take care of myself. But I noticed recently, like if somebody was upsetting me, I might not have handled it the best I could. And I need to go back to think about yoga, like take a breath, you know, it's going to be fine. It's not that big of a deal. And so it's very grounding. So the reason I bring this up is because when students have skills and resources and techniques, they can lean on that.
You're absolutely right. And as educators, hopefully we know what those skills are that students have and figure out ways for students to make some of those natural connections.
Yeah. What do you think, what are some ways we're going to move through this mental health pandemic? Because I talked about STEM and STEAM, and mental health has not been embedded in the curriculum. And I know there've been some initiatives, but not every school has the same initiative. But how do you think we're going to move through this?
Probably a lot of different things. And then also some really, and there's probably some simple things we can do as well, like right now. You know, state tests are not going away anytime soon, which sets the expectation for what learning should be done and how we measure success. So if our sure, if we overhauled that, we could replace it with a standard for success that might have more positive impacts on mental health. That's a big thing. That's probably not happening anytime soon. So then the question is, so like, how do we create different understandings of what success is and what our goals are within a school or within a classroom? And I think that's really where it starts. Is we get, as educators, we do some of that work ourselves. We start thinking like, yeah, like, what is making me happy right now? What are some of the things that I've been talking about doing and I just haven't done yet? And avoid moving into the place where you start, bad mouthing yourself about not having done that, and instead be that good friend to yourself, like you are to your students, and inquire a little bit, like, hey, so what's happening? Why isn't it happening? What might help it happen? And so, and I say this, and there's a more thoughtful process around how, and you could and would and have spoken to processes that adults can take to be more reflective and do that goal setting. But I do think it starts with adults being familiar with that process themselves, so that when they sit down with a student at the beginning of a semester and we start getting into some questions about, hey, so what are we trying to achieve? Every single educator starts the year with some of those questions, but rarely do educators then move from, hey, so a kid wants to do their homework more often. Like, what's that about? Like, let's talk more about it. So is there a skill? Like, why do you want to improve your homework more? Oftentimes kids are going to probably say something like, well, because my teachers tell me to. Or they'll say, because
my teachers what?
Tell me to. They say that I need to do that. Or my parents, or my grades. These are all external motivations. We got to tap into like, what else is going on for that student? Like, what's motivating them? And if it's not homework, well, maybe we should talk about something else. Or if it keeps on coming back to their relationships with their parents, maybe their goal is to improve their relationship with their parents. Okay, so what are some ways we can do that? So really slowing down and understanding, what is a good goal? What makes a profound, helpful, effective goal? Not talking about a SMART goal. For educators out there, that's something I'm sure they're familiar with, that acronym. But like a goal that is actually values-based, that takes you somewhere, but then also being familiar with the messiness of that process that people go on when they try to figure out a goal. And I think when we start doing that in our classroom, and we start to, what we end up doing is we start to really co-construct really helpful criteria for what a meaningful school year looks like. Once we start doing that, I think beautiful things can really start to happen.
Definitely. Now, have you heard of the Mental Health Youth Action Forum that went to DC?
I'm not.
It's about 30. It's okay. About 30 students. It was coordinated by MTV, and they met with the U.S. Surgeon General.
Cool.
A lot of students I've spoken to said, there's so much data and research, but what are we doing now? Like, what's happening to improve mental health? I mean, there's gun violence, and there's so much anxiety and social media, and they just want to know that there are strategies that are going to happen now.
So strategies that I would encourage folks to do, and I don't have a text to recommend off the top of my head, but I'm looking forward to doing that. But some sort of, I come back to like familiarizing yourself with a process where you yourself are working towards a goal. We talk all the time with educators around, when you assign a project, you should do the project first. Why? Because, well, one, you have an exemplar, but not an exemplar for students to copy off of, but for students to know, like, what is it that you're talking about?
Yeah.
But then the other piece around it is that you are familiar with some of the misconceptions that might come up. You might start to see some of the places where people might get stuck. And so doing that work yourself can make your charge to your students about finding a goal that much more authentic. Think on a related note, you walk into any business, you walk into any school these days, you'll probably see values plastered on the wall.
Yeah.
which is a good thing. Historically, that probably wasn't the case. But you talk to any third grader and up, they're going to know with complete certainty whether or not that value is just for show or not. And so I think
Would you say it's for show?
Yeah, or not. Like, is it real, right? And I think that as school leaders, one of the things that can happen is if you don't have values, engage in a process around co-constructing that with your community. And if you do have values, come back to them and really, as a school leader, start to own them. Like, figure out ways in which right now there are opportunities to model compassion in your conversations with your teachers, with your students, with your families, and take stock of where you're not doing it, and maybe create an opportunity in a forum to take some responsibility. Again, not in a let's just attract negative attention, but let's own where we are as a community so that we're living with as much integrity as possible. And I think when we do that, we're creating an exemplar for our students and our young people as a pathway to live.
Definitely. Matthew, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on the show.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.